this morning I'm going to talk about providing services to victims and survivors of trafficking in particular, but also some related populations, client populations, including unaccompanied minors a little bit, refugees, and folks that are in alternatives to detention who are in most cases asylum seekers, but more broadly are people in immigration removal proceedings. I work right now at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in Migration and Refugee Services. We are a faith-based organization, obviously by the name of the organization, but we also have been a long-standing social service provider, sort of like a nonprofit. We administer programs on behalf of the federal government, providing refugee resettlement services, services to unaccompanied minors who are apprehended at ports of entry and along the border, interior enforcements as well. In that case, we provide foster care, so smaller family-based residential services for the more vulnerable unaccompanied minors, as well as overseas refugee minor arrivals. And then we do a lot of the community-based programming for the unaccompanied minors in the community. Post-release services is what they call that in the field. So we're just really making sure that when the kids who've been released to a sponsor in the community are getting all their immediate needs met, getting enrolled in school, getting any kind of medical mental health services they may need, and that they're being connected ideally with an attorney to move them through their immigration court process. Our trafficking programs have really run the whole spectrum of being service-based, where we're getting, again, federal grants from the government to provide services to survivors of trafficking. We were one of the first organizations to get services back in the very early 2000s after the passage of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which I'm sure you've already learned about here. The first grants were being made coming out of both Department of Justice and Department of Health, Office of Refugee Resettlement. We had some grants from DOJ to start up some task forces. And then we had some grants from Health and Human Services to provide the initial stabilizing services to foreign national victims and survivors of trafficking, about kind of a 6 to 9 month period. Over the years, we've continued that kind of work. We've also done programming for survivors of trafficking a little bit further into their restoration process. I'm going to talk a little bit about that program, Dignity of Work, where we're trying to help survivors really move forward and move towards real self-sufficiency. And then we do a lot of education and outreach, both kind of capacity building to our networks of Catholic agencies, primarily Catholic charities, but we also do outreach to vulnerable communities using our church networks, some of the ministries, some of the volunteer and charitable organizations that are in communities that are very much kind of more at risk for being trafficked. We really focus on, because we're migrant and refugee services, we focus more on the foreign nationals, so immigrant communities, other newcomers, doing rights-based outreach and education through peer educators, so kind of a train-the-trainer model. And then very recently, we've been doing some alternative to detention service programming, where we are serving people, again, who are in removal proceedings, immigration removal proceedings, providing services through our Catholic Charities partners, really in those cases, primarily around behavioral health, so mental health screening, and then family and individual counseling as needed. And then also what we call psychoeducation, so parenting classes, anti-trafficking kind of prevention classes, really just helping them get acclimated to the new community in the US, what are US norms, how to protect themselves, and how to reach out for assistance if they need it. So I'm going to talk today really about the evolution of the field of services to survivors of trafficking, and really focus on some best practices that have kind of become more adopted, a lot more commonplace in the field in the last few years, and then give a couple of examples. Please feel free to ask questions. You can just kind of raise your hand. I'm going to apologize that I had a significant birthday not long ago, and so now I have glasses to see close, but I can't see you. And then I can see you, but now I can't see my notes. So I will probably be just like fiddling with my glasses because it sucks to get old. And then I think I should have a good sort of chunk of time at the end for questions, but do feel free to interrupt along the way. So the Catholic Church really tries when they do service programs, and certainly as I was developing programs for us to implement, we really try and think through how can we apply sort of the good Catholic teaching, like around the dignity of the human person. And this notion of integral human development is meant to be really holistic, where we're thinking of the whole person. And so we're thinking about what would that person need to be financially stable, to have meaningful employment? What would that person need to successfully, engage in, whether it's politics or just sort of, social and kind of sociological association. So just be a good active member of their community and an empowered member of their community. How does that person fit in their family? How are they a support to their family? How are they supported by their family in healthy relationships? So that really is this notion of integral human development. If you're thinking about it at the community level, it really is about empowering communities to be well represented, again, actively engaged in politics and in the economics of their larger community. And when it's at the individual level, it's how do you help that person really move themselves forward to be successful in all these different domains. And so when we think about how we've worked through refugee programming in particular, we focus a lot and do a lot to support ethnic and community-based organizations, these mutual aid associations. That's one way that, and we do that in some of our other programming as well, but primarily the refugee programs are great examples because those folks are coming in with a legal status and can sort of stabilize their immediate needs a little more quickly and then really focus on integrating into the community. And we find that kind of mutual aid society is really helpful. It's really empowering, and then they become their own best advocates. I would say we've done a good job when we in the refugee programs as well of hiring prior clients, hiring people from the communities themselves as employees. Not only do you get the language and the cultural competency, but you also are certainly helping people who are new to the community, new to the country, get into a professional kind of career track. So that's a real, some real positive examples that we are now trying to bring into the trafficking work and into the field of serving victims and survivors of trafficking, trying to get more people with that lived experience into the field. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a couple more slides. When we talk about victims of trafficking, victims, survivors of trafficking, we're also really focusing on having a trauma-informed lens, a trauma informed perspective in how we are both designing programs and then how we're implementing and delivering services in that one-on-one interaction with a client. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today as well, because we really have made some positive strides towards a more trauma-informed kind of case management and other services, other interactions with trafficking survivors. And I do want to really highlight that. I will say early on, in retrospect, I can now reflect back and we, though well-meaning, may have made some real missteps in how we were serving victims and survivors of trafficking in particular. And I will say that, we were very focused on meeting their immediate basic needs. We designed programs for people coming directly out of a trafficking situation. That really was the paradigm. That's kind of how our cases worked in the very earliest days, where there would be some kind of a raid, or there would be an investigation that would lead to a raid and recovery. And so people really were coming to the social service providers out of trafficked situations. And so they really did need their kind of immediate needs to be met. But I think we were really ignoring the fact that people probably did have social networks. They may have had friends and family who were who they could have turned to for support. We were very, I will say in the early days, very concerned about the impact that family members might have on a victim or a survivor on, perhaps exposing them to re-exploitation. We were very concerned about unhealthy relationships. We were very concerned about people having trauma bonds and going back to traffickers and getting back into exploitative situations, to the point that I think we may have sort of overly protected people, been a little bit over restrictive in those early days. And that's something that we're definitely moving away from. The other area I think where we've made some positive strides is in thinking about the survivors that we were serving as all of us were getting to know these survivors and beginning to talk about real case studies and trends in cases. We recognized very early on that the trafficking situation was very often not the first exploitative or abusive situation that individual had been in. And we saw that a lot of people had a lot of traumatic and histories of victimization that made them more vulnerable to being trafficked in many ways. And so there was a real recognition early on that we needed to be treating and thinking about how to meet the needs of someone who had this immediate victimizing, this immediate kind of exploitative, abusive circumstances and experiences, but also thinking like, and then we're going to begin to unpack with them things in their past and really work on that also. So then later on, we started to hear in other related social service fields, the ACEs, I'm totally blanking, ACEs. Help me out here. It's the adverse childhood experiences. And we were like, oh, we're all over that in the trafficking. We know all about that. But again, the problem was, I think, in retrospect, and as we were designing some of our more recent programs, we really undervalued the strengths that people were bringing and the positive, really, again, strengths and characteristics that people had, even if they were coming from these adverse earlier experiences. And I think we didn't always build on those strengths. We focused a bit too much on, what are all of the horrible things that have happened to someone that we need to now, work through, rather than really trying to look at, what are they bringing to the table that are these, positive survival skills, positive, abilities to interact in a really, difficult situation, to be able to be adaptive and responsive and reactive in positive ways. I think we really undervalued that. And so in designing programs, and then certainly in doing outreach, I talk a lot about, we need to really think about people who have been exploited in labor trafficking, sex trafficking, as people who are risk takers in a positive way, that many times, people who get recruited into a labor exploitative situation, it's because they are willing to take a risk. They're willing to take a job in another country. They're willing to, take a job where it seems like, there's, you have to work really hard, and then eventually you'll start earning money, but first you have to pay off your debt. And they're optimistic. I can work hard. I can, put my head down and I will work off that debt. And then I will begin to make money that I can send to my family. So there are people who are willing to take risks, people who are willing to work hard, people who are willing to try sort of something that is kind of unknown and has some uncertainty, but they have a confidence and they are willing, they have that sense of whether it's responsibility, obligation to their families or to themselves to make that effort and put themselves out there. Even in the sex trafficking cases, I think, we hear about, I think a lot of times we think over, a bit, again, too much that that people are faced with no good choices and just, end up really being taken advantage of and into these situations, which very often is the case. I mean, absolutely, people who have good choices don't end up in taking and moving into some of these, commercial sex work necessarily. But when you think about, and I think about this, people who run away from home, teenagers, for example, who are running away from home, running away from a group home, they're putting themselves at risk. They know they're going out into a riskier situation, but there is something about that. This situation is not good enough for me. I'm not tolerating this situation anymore, that I think we need to respect, and we need to build on that. And I think importantly, we need to tell that to these individuals that, I respect that. I respect that you ran away from a bad situation. Like, good for you. I respect that you didn't stay in an abusive relationship, didn't stay in an abusive, household where you were being, victimized in any number of different ways. And, good for you. And, you ended up in another precarious situation, but here we are now, let's move forward. But acknowledging that people made what were probably very good choices, very good decisions for themselves in the moment, maybe not with a lot of great options, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that, recognize that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about this, but build on those characteristics, build on people's willingness to take risks, build on people's unwillingness to tolerate, terrible situations, and really try and build on, I think, these strengths that many of these people have that I don't think we always recognized early on. Okay, another area I'll talk about just real quickly and then move into how to be better trauma informed. Another area where we've made some real improvements. Oh yeah, question. Oh, you need a microphone so the webinar folks can hear you. 1 second. Here it comes.
I just want to comment on, we would all do the same. When you're talking to these people and you're trying to empathize or understand, I am guaranteed you're in this situation, in the same situation, you would do exactly the same. You're going to get up in the morning if you have that possibility, and you're going to walk you're going to do whatever you got to do to survive. So just, to please try to put yourself in the position of that other person. It really helps to understand and, help out as much as possible. They're not all, good people, but the vast majority of them are, and they just want to get forward. They just want to survive. And, talking with US employers here who may, be going outside the law to employ these people, they're so interested in employing these hungry immigrants because they're so dedicated. They want to work. They come every day. They'll get to the job. They won't come late. They're just impressive, really impressive. So just to be nice and again try to put yourself in their position, please.
Yeah, I think empathy is really fantastic. I think it's really important to empathize. I think it's important for people who are receiving the services to not feel like, you're this very successful person, professional, have it all together. You're a good-hearted person, so you're helping them, and their lives are pretty messy. And so, yeah, I think really empathizing and normalizing what they're going through and what they've been through, what they felt, the decisions they made, normalizing that. Like, yeah, in the same situation, I would probably do the same thing. It really goes a long way to bringing them up to your level. And I think that's really important. And we'll talk a little bit about this, of needing to be respectful in a genuine way and look at the people that you're serving in whatever capacity as really an equal. And that is tremendously important, and something, again, that we didn't necessarily always do quite as well in the past, and we're definitely figuring that out. But yeah, empathy, fantastic. Okay, so I'm gonna move. There we go. So when we think about being trauma informed, the point of being trauma informed is to best serve people who have been through something traumatic, whether an immediate, recent, horrific, or more long, drawn out, long-term, or multiple phases of trauma. But to be trauma informed is to make sure that as you're serving or interacting in any capacity with individuals, that you're not going to compound or make that worse, that you're not going to inadvertently make it difficult for them to engage with you and engage with the services in a way that will help them the best take advantage of those services. I mean, we want people who are accessing our services or who are engaging with us in whether it's a criminal case, criminal investigation, whatever your capacity, you want them to do the best. You want them to get the most out of it. Frankly, if you're on the more prosecution end, you want to get the most out of what you can from them to have a successful case. And so it's in everyone's interest that people really maximize the services that they're engaged in. And to do that, they need to be trauma informed. So safety is really critical. People need to be and feel safe, not just be safe, feel safe in order to be fully engaged and fully present with you. If someone doesn't feel safe, half of easily what you're saying just goes in one ear and right out the other, because they're thinking like, I got to get safe, I got to get safe, I got to get safe. Transparency and trustworthiness. I'm going to go over all these in a lot more detail, but you have to be a good partner in this. You have to be a good counterpart that they can trust, and that comes through being transparent and honest and forthright as much as possible. Peer support, people do well when good people are helping them out. They do better when people that they can relate to are interacting with them, and they have then, you know, positive role models, and they can see people like them succeeding. And then also they can just connect often better. So peer support is really critical. Being collaborative, and that this mutuality, which is very similar to just being trustworthy, but really engaging in a mutual collaborative way with the people you're serving and engaging with, but also with all of your external partners. And we'll talk a lot more about that. You really want to make sure that you're trying to empower and uplift the people that you're working with, whether, again, you're serving or interacting in a legal or investigation case. You want to empower them so that they feel positive, they feel engaged in a positive way, feel optimistic, and then they'll have that buy-in to keep going with the process. You want to give people a voice, you want to give people choices as well. And that's become a lot more apparent to all of us in the field, that we need to give people more choices in how we're serving and what kind of services. The cultural, historical, and gender issues, that's another area where we've just become a lot more nuanced, a lot more sophisticated in our thinking of what does that mean? Does it mean an interpreter? Yes, for sure. Is that all it means? No, not at all. You really need to be a lot more thoughtful and deliberate and conscientious about how you're interacting and engaging and serving and connecting people to other services, connecting with you through these lenses of sort of a cultural, historical, gender, and other lenses and perspectives of identity and how people identify themselves. And so we'll talk about all of that. So over the years, recently, there's been a lot more research being done, evidence-based research now, program evaluations, studies to figure out like what works. We've been doing this work for about 20 years now. And so we can look back, we can look at our programs and look at some outcomes and say like, what does work? What works best? What works better under which conditions? And that helps inform future program designing. Also, we've done a really great job of being a lot more respectful and taking a lot more advantage and incorporating a lot more of that individuals with lived experiences perspective, not just on testifying and speaking about, you know, this happened to me, this really does happen, you know, trafficking exists even in your community, I'm an example, blah, blah, blah. We did a lot of that kind of survivor testimony as a way of just sort of getting the public, getting other professionals to take this seriously. It was a bit of a, I think back now about a bit of a, not a panic, but just this feeling of like, people are not taking this seriously enough. They don't get how prevalent this is, or they don't get how complicated it is to recognize. They're picturing really stereotypical cases from Law and Order, and they're not thinking about these more nuanced cases. And here's someone who had a nuanced case that can speak to that. And it really does resonate to have someone speak about their real experience. But it's not necessarily the healthiest for them. And it really is also ignoring all of the other input and insight and perspective and expertise that they can bring to the table. And so having people with that lived experience, not just spread the word, and maybe not even just give you, you know, satisfaction surveys of like, yeah, my case manager was great. No, I didn't like the job developer. And you guys made me, you know, come to too many meetings. I mean, that's helpful, but more helpful is them to really inform about, these are the kind of services that I really would have liked. This is where I really wish we'd spent the most time. I really wish I had been able to do X, Y, and Z. So that kind of feedback, and then pulling people together, not just after the fact, but beforehand, and say, we're going to come up with a program. We want to serve people to provide, in our case, it was the job readiness services and employment. What should we do? What would you want? What would look good to you? And so having people engaged before in that design phase has been really critical and really helpful and really, I think, moving programming forward. Okay. So when we talk about safety, we really do need to be collaborative, because my idea of what's going to keep a trafficking survivor safe versus what that person needs to feel safe could be very different. And it really is important to have them help define and sort of direct what safe feels like to them. And that means that you may have very different, if you're working with multiple people, whether you're on a big case with 20 different victims that came out of an investigation, for example, or if you're a case manager and you have a caseload of 18 people, you may have 18 different sort of definitions of what it's going to take for that, each person to feel safe. So it needs to be collaborative. You need to ask them what they need. It also needs to be not isolating. I mentioned this, earlier, that cutting people off from their social networks may seem like the right thing to do if their social networks are also still engaged in some of the work or the sex work, or their family, and didn't their family help arrange this in the first place and they ended up in this situation. And so what you need to then think about is, you can't just cut people off completely if that's who they need to feel safe, if that's who they need to have connections with, if they're going to be concerned about, I have to worry about my mom and I can't think about this plan if I'm worried about my mom. And so even though, yes, it was my mom that made these arrangements and I ended up working in this cantina in Houston, not at a restaurant, it's still, my mom is important to me. So making sure you don't isolate people too much, and just then focus on how do they have healthy relationships with boundaries, and how do you help them move forward in sort of improving relationships so that they are getting all the support, but without being, negative or dysfunctional. And so it's a more difficult process for sure than just saying like, oh, you can't talk to that person, or you can only talk to that person if I'm in the room listening to the conversation, which we used to do quite a bit of. The other thing that's important is when you think about information sharing. How do we end up? Oh no, sorry. Not information sharing. Back to the just non-contingent access to service, thinking about, you can't hold out a service and say, did you want to go into a shelter? Do you want to go into a detox program? Do you want access to a legal service, to an attorney? Then you have to do this. And when you start to make things that kind of a contingent, then that can be it can be a real turnoff. It can be a real turnoff in particular to people who were victimized by having things held over their head and having threats made and having things taken away as consequences. And so you have to be very cognizant of not repeating that kind of trafficking dynamic of saying like, if you want this, you have to do this for me, because that's what the traffickers had done, whether it's in employment or in commercial sex. Guaranteed, that is the kind of language that was used, and those are the coercive kind of tactics that were used. And so you don't want to get caught up in that same, I can get you into a shelter, I can do this or that if you, do a deposition or testify against this person, or if you, go through this process and do all of these other services. So just to the degree that your programs or your, whatever your investigations allow, being as accommodating as possible, and just recognize, even if you ultimately are presenting, the reality is if you want into this program, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Even your tone can make a big difference. And so even if there really are contingencies, you can't have this without doing that. There's ways to present that without it feeling or sounding to the client or the person you're interacting with as that kind of same kind of oppressive tactic. The other thing you want to think about is just, again, not overusing detention, not overusing the criminal justice system in order to serve people. Yes, question.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to ask, you said that there's ways that you could present the non-contingent access to services. Is it possible that you can share some examples of those ways?
Sure. So one of the, it's a great question. And I have been thinking about, some of the services that we are offering are time limited, for example, and several years ago, that very much was the case. And so if you were a foreign national survivor of trafficking and you were an adult, if you wanted to get into the federal program that would provide there was a budget to help get them into housing and pay for, basic needs and connect them to medical care and all of that. To be an enrolled client, you had to cooperate with law enforcement, for example. You had to be willing to be interviewed by whether it was an ICE investigator or the FBI or whomever. And so that was, and I'm not exaggerating, in the intake forms that we use, that was like question number 3. Are you willing to cooperate with law enforcement on your case, willing to work with law enforcement? And in the moment, they were like, what? No. And you're like, okay, but no. Just say yes, because don't you want me to then, provide all these services? And I think, and we were trying to sort of cajole people like, you just have to talk to them one time and they probably won't even want to work with you because they're not going to want to talk to you more than one. And it was like this kind of cajoling, or just to say like, but if you want all these other services, you have to do this. Or they were time limited. And so it was like, well, if you don't do this now, that's it. Like, we can't help you. If you don't leave if you're in a commercial sex situation and it's like your boyfriend that's the one that's making all the arrangements, you're like, well, you can't come into my program if you don't absolutely cut off contact with that person. And now we're much more nuanced. We're like, okay, like, I think the DOJ has taken away some of those provisions in their services. So someone who has not, fully renounced their lifestyle can be served for a few months. If they have like a backslide and go back out and get back into the commercial sex and they come back in a few months, you can say, yes, you can come back. Accessing services is not as contingent on working with law enforcement, but in some cases, some things are. You have to go through some shelter programs have like what's it called? Like a cutoff, or like a period where like for the first 90 days or 30 days, you can't talk to anybody. And so there's ways to say like, here are the benefits of this program. Here's what it's going to offer you. Here's what you have to give up to do that. And it's up to you. And if you don't like that, I will try and find something else. And I think just presenting people and not browbeating them into things, but also saying like, you can say no to me and you're not gonna hurt my feelings. You can come back and get other services. I can provide these services, but not housing. I can try to find another shelter that maybe won't have all of these services, but it'll have this and this, and you don't have to go through this. I think just being more detailed and recognizing that it's not your job to do whatever it takes to get them into a program. And maybe that is the real improvement. And that willingness to like, well, if you don't want what I'm offering, I can at least try and connect you to something else. Instead of like, well, you're out. Yeah, thanks. Okay. The transparency and trust, a lot of that, I think actually, plays off of what we were just describing, that you have to be transparent. You have to share information. Also explaining like, here's my role. This is what I can do for you. This is what I, have in sort of my toolkit that I can do. Here's what I can't do. Here's what this person over here will do that I'll connect you to. Being accountable to that person. If I can't do this for you, I will find someone that can. I will find some other program that can. I think that's really important. And then people sort of upfront and then repeating it over and over is helpful, because I think, if you front end too much information when you're engaging with someone, especially if they're more recently coming out of an exploitative or abusive situation, they're not going to hear everything, but you want to be transparent about, this is what I can do. Can't do these other things, can do these things, can connect you to people that can do these other things. The other area I think that's really important is around the information sharing and thinking about when you're collecting someone's personal history during an intake, for example, or you're trying to figure out, is this person eligible for my program? Screening and screening tools are those kind of survey questions that you would ask someone to figure out whether they're eligible or not for a particular program, whether they fit into a particular category of a crime victim. Is this a smuggling case or a trafficking case? Is this a extortion, smuggling extortion case? Is this person eligible for my DOJ program, or would they be better suited at the domestic violence program or some other program? And so the screening is about figuring out whether the situation, the conditions the person has left, characteristics of their case meet the program requirements. And so you don't need a lot of detail about what really happened to someone. A criminal, like a law enforcement investigator, might need a few more details in order to determine smuggling, trafficking, or smuggling, extortion, whatever it may be. But you should be collecting the minimum in order to just sort of make that determination. You don't really need all the gory details. You don't need someone to relate everything. It's also really important to think about then the assessment phase, which is a separate process. And an assessment from a service provider or a legal service provider is trying to figure out, okay, what do you need? What kind of services do you need? What kind of an application are we going to file? And then what information do I need to make the best connections for you? And again, I don't need to hear everything. I don't need all of the, a list of all the different ways that you may have been abused or humiliated or threatened or exploited. And I think it's important to be very mindful of that. Don't collect more of someone's personal history than you need to do your job in serving that person or filling whatever role you have. And it's also really important to share with that person what you're going to do with the information you're collecting and who you might share it with and who you won't share it with. Because it's very unsettling for someone to come into an office and look around and wonder, like, how many people here know that my pimp used to do X, Y, and Z to, how many people know that one of the ways that my boss would, punish me was blah, blah, blah. People don't want everyone to know their business, especially really sensitive things like that. And so it's really important that you don't collect, ask, find out, ask if they describe as much as that, than you really need, and that you're also really clear about, this just stays with me. I won't share this with anyone else. Or you can even stop people like, whoa, I don't need to hear all of this in order to do, what we're doing today. If you want to share, that's great, that you can keep talking. Be a good active listener, but you can also redirect people, and you don't have to share this with me if you don't feel comfortable or if you don't want to, or this is something that you maybe want to tell your attorney because they really need to hear this, but I don't. And maybe you don't want to say, tell this twice. And so save this for your attorney. And so just being really mindful of how much information you're getting from people, and then being very clear to them of how you might be sharing that or not sharing it. Some information you do have to share. And then that's really important to be clear about too. I am going to have to share this with the other investigator on the team. I will have to share this with the prosecutor of the case. I mean, just be honest with people so that they can then make good choices about how much they are divulging. And then again, if people do want to share, be a good active listener and just listen, respond in a healthy way. There's a whole presentation you can do on how to be a good active listener during like any kind of interview or those kind of situations. For law enforcement, in my experience, they're seeing their role is seen as very as a mix, obviously of the enforcement piece, and sometimes people have had negative interactions, but sometimes they really also do see them as protective, kind of, as the role of a protector. And so sometimes people do want to open up to law enforcement folks. Sometimes people are aware of what a prosecutor, what their role is, and they do want justice. And so they will want to share with a prosecutor. Sometimes they recognize that, they are worried about having certain needs met, or there's something they really think they need, and they're willing to share that with a case manager who they know then can help make that happen. And so people, if you explain what your roles are, explain how the information can be used or why it needs to be used, people will be pretty forthcoming appropriately. You just want to be very careful and encourage that kind of appropriate forthcomingness, not oversharing, and also not over prying, if that makes sense. Questions? I saw, no, okay, it's my eyes, okay. The other piece, just real quickly, is whether you're a mandatory reporter. Many of us are professionals and have these kind of mandatory reporting requirements. It's really important to share that and explain that to your clients or the people that you're interacting with. And you can say, if you describe that you're thinking about hurting yourself, hurting someone else, I have to report that. Or you're a minor, and so if you were abused in a certain way, I have to report that. And here's who I'm going to report that to. This is probably what will happen next, so that people know what to expect and understand it. But certainly, if you are a mandatory reporter, you need to be transparent about that, and then you need to follow through also, and just make sure that you're following all of your ethical and organizational regulations for sure. Okay, all right, strengths-based, this is my favorite part. So when you're working with, again, in whatever your role is, whether you're a social service provider, or you're working more as like an investigator or a legal service provider, again, with the transparency, what is your role? What are you doing? What's your role in this case? What do you need from them? What are you going to provide to them or contribute to them in their case? That's really important. Again, it's also the idea of, are we documenting information? Are we saving information? Just being, again, very transparent about where their information is going and giving them choice to share as much as they want to share or not. The other thing, again, that I think is really critical, and I was touching on this at the very beginning, is that when you are, and this is more for a social service provider folks, that when you're assessing someone in order to provide services for them, you want to not just, clearly you're going to have your own assessment tools, you're asking questions. It's good to use validated tools. Nowadays there are validated tools out there. It's good to use evidence-based instruments and tools. They're out there now. And so you don't have to kind of make it up yourself. You can go out, look at what's available, what other people have used and developed and tested in order to use good tools. The other thing I think that's really important and that we've adopted and really loved are these more objective tools that are like strengths, so we use the Gallup Strengths Finder tool in our employment programs. If you work in an organization, you've probably taken something like this, where you answer a whole bunch of seemingly, questions that are kind of about work, kind of about you personally, and it's all about your preferences, how you react to different situations. And in the end, you get a report that tells you, what you're good at. And often we do this in like job retreats. Has everyone done one of these? Is it just my organization that does this all the time? No, okay. So you get a report at the end that says like, you're a detailed person, you're reliable, people go to you and they know that you're going to have like the right information. And that's, those are the assets that you bring to your job. Or maybe you're not a detailed person, but you're a visionary and you're creative and you can, you're a problem solver. Or maybe it's like, you're really good at interrelating with people. You're the peacemaker. You can also persuade people to, get things done and bring people along on a new project. You've all heard all this kind of language, right? Imagine if you'd never heard what you were good at. Imagine if you'd never had any sense of like what skills you really have, other than what could be just, really, particular and super work related, but maybe never validated. Even if you were like the best person in a sweatshop, or if you were the, a really amazing nanny and doing a great job, but the family that, you were living with and working for never, all they did was criticize you. And so it's really helpful for people to hear what they're good at. And those of us in sort of the professional world where we do these kind of assessments or we get evaluations every year, we get a lot of feedback, and most of it ideally for all of us is pretty positive. And so it's really quite moving sometimes for these survivors to hear just, objectively. It's not you making it up. Like they filled out the survey, and the survey is like, you're really good at interrelating with people. You'd be really good at persuading people to go along on a project. You're a born leader, or you're reliable, or you're a visionary, and you're creative. It's fantastic. And the feedback that we got from clients when they took these and got their results was just, it was moving how much they appreciated it. And they, it prints it out and it looks nice, and they would keep them and they would it was like a touchstone for them. Things aren't going so great, but when I get out there and I get in a job, I'm a detail person. People are going to come to me. I'm going to know all the, policies, and I'm going to be a real asset on a team someday. And so we found that to be really powerful. And the fact that these objective tools was more validating to people, because they felt like it's not just, Hillary, she's real nice. She's, she always says nice things. She's like, like your mom, like, "Ooh, you're so pretty," like they felt like it was more real because it was this objective test. So we do all kinds of skill inventories and these kind of personality tests, and find that people really appreciate that. You can get some of these kind of tests in other languages now. It's, again, you want to go with something reputable if possible. And so I really recommend that. Okay, then when it comes to your client-driven service plans, you again want to have the clients help set their priorities. And again, what I think is the most important and what people need may not be what they think is the most important and what they need. And if you're not listening to and trying to meet your clients' needs, then in the back of their head, in every meeting and probably off and on throughout the day, they're constantly thinking about that unmet need. And I think the most difficult example that I've had, and it's happened more than once, is when there's a mother and her children are either in CPS custody or back in a home country. And that's what she needs, is her child with her. And so it doesn't matter what we're working on, in the back of her mind, it's, I want my kid. I need my kid. I'm worried about my kid. I don't think my kid has enough to eat. Here's me, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, I'm worried about my kid. And I keep telling you, and you keep telling me there's nothing you can do, or it's going to take more months. And so even if it's something like getting a child out of CPS custody or getting a child a humanitarian visa to get into the US, and it will take months and it might not happen, and it certainly won't be easy, you have to put that on the service plan. You have to be accountable that you're working whatever you can towards that also, and at least acknowledge that it is something that's, in the works, and honestly do what you can to sort of make those kind of things happen. It's really important to recognize what people's priorities are, and that not addressing them, even if it's just, I made 2 calls to blah, 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 blah this month, and this is what I got back, but now this is working better, or at least we got this form filled out, I got this thing signed. Try to at least reporting that kind of progress is meaningful, and it will be helpful. But if you just say like, look, it's not going to be for months, or we can't fix that, then you really are going to lose their trust, and you're going to lose their buy-in, and then they're just distracted with their own unmet needs. And so, and sometimes they're not that complicated. Sometimes what people want isn't that complicated. It just doesn't occur to us always to ask. And so it's really important. And again, there are tools, case management tools and instruments out there now that really, or just even frameworks to come up with your own case management tools that really do have prompts to help you do a better job of incorporating and asking what people's priorities are, and incorporating them into a service plan. Okay. Service plans also need to be broken up into short, kind of the immediate things that we're going to work on and need to, get immediate things, and then those intermediate and longer term, and helping people think in that kind of staged or phased process is useful. It's helpful. It can be a real challenge, come again, this sort of trauma lens, like people who have had really traumatic histories, people who are coming out of very traumatic situations. Long-term thinking and planning is one of those functional areas that gets the most damaged and is the most difficult to sort of rebuild intellectually. And so it can be a real challenge to work with someone who just, because of the trauma and because of their recent and maybe even long-standing experiences, they just don't think long-term. They're like, well, lady, I'm happy if I know what's happening to me tomorrow. And that's how I think, and that's how I live. And not that people People are dynamic, they can learn, they can get out of that mode, but that's a hard mode to get out of. And it's important as the case manager to recognize you need to help that person get out of that mode and move into this more short-term, intermediate, long-term. And again, there's ways to help make connections between a medium, intermediate, or a long-term goal and some more immediate steps. And that can be a real smart and helpful way to manage and work with a client to really, here's the intermediate step, and I'm going to lay that out so you can see that we're making these intermediate sort of progressive steps towards this longer term goal that you want. But again, it's not easy. And then dynamic, you have to be able to change a service plan. You have to be able to adapt it, recognize that as things come up, it has to be malleable and dynamic. And again, that accountability, you have to be able to sort of report back to your client and thinking, we don't want to move into I don't know, I have mixed feelings about this idea of like a customer service model to case management, but there is a level of accountability. There's a level of like, your client's the boss, right? Like your client's the one that you're accountable to. Did I do that thing I said I was going to do last week for you? Did I make that arrangement? Did I follow through on something I said I would do? And even if you're in the law enforcement or the legal service piece, if you give people like, oh yeah, I'm going to work on your asylum application or your T visa application, or we're going to talk to the prosecutor and then I'm going to, hand everything off and now we're done. And then you come back and you're like, oh, you have to like do one more deposition, or, oh yeah, we're missing this one form. And so, I didn't do it. And just, people remember those shortcomings and they remember when things don't move forward the way they were expecting. And then you'll begin to lose their trust. You'll begin to lose their buy-in. So it is important that you are accountable. And if you don't meet if you couldn't get to something, that transparency, that honesty, trustworthiness can go a long way. Okay. Collaboration and mutuality. Again, you have to be collaborative with your client. The two of you need to, again, to try to elevate the person as much as you really can so that you guys are on equal footing as you're mapping out the service plan, mapping out what's going to happen. Even if you're, again, in these other legal service role or investigator, really, they're your sort of, critical subject witness, key witness. And so, helping to elevate them and get their buy-in and explain, here's what I'm doing, here's what we need from you, that's your contribution, my contribution, and that's helpful. And then also helping, again, them set the planning and the priorities, but also the tempo and the level of engagement. I think this is another area where we as case managers certainly are learning to let the clients dictate the tempo. We, again, used to have a lot of programs with very prescribed service periods. You get this service for 3 months and then these services for 6 months and then that's it. And if you don't show up to my office for 3 months out of that 6-month period, you're only getting served 3 months. And we're recognizing that there needs to be a way to pause these kind of time delimited services to say like, well, if you stop coming in, I'm going to stop the clock. And then when you do come back, you still have 4 more months. You didn't lose 3 when you were not around. And so most of the federal agencies that are funding these, DOJ, HHS, they're recognizing that there needs to be a pause so that people who have, life happens and they are not engaged in the services for a period aren't burning through a time limited amount of kind of service, that they're not losing their access to those services. So if that's something in your own program that you can work in as a way to pause and then re-engage. I know with criminal investigations, that's not always possible, but if it is at all possible to just, engage. If people kind of vanish and disappear, you don't like throw the case aside and then they're back and they're like, okay, I'm ready now. And you're like, we dumped that case. So anyway, just that kind of flexibility. Certainly it's easier on the case management side. And then the level of engagement also, a tempo level of engagement, it needs to be client driven as much as possible. The other way we have to collaborate is with all of our external partners. And that really is where You need to have good, healthy relationships with other providers. You need to know what services are around. Again, you need to be able to give your client choices. And if you don't have the kind of service in your organization that they really want, is there someone else in the community that does provide that and you can connect them? And so working on building up that service array, that service capacity, that multidisciplinary approach is so critical. But not only having every category met in a multidisciplinary kind of team approach, but having a couple of options. Like you don't just need one therapist, you need a couple different kinds of therapeutic model service providers. And I will say that my very, very first purely trafficking case where we got DOJ funding, I'd been working with unaccompanied minors and working very closely with the Homeland Security investigations and with FBI on cases that were unaccompanied minors in trafficking situations in the early 2000s, but we finally got DOJ funding just to do trafficking. And our very first case, we were so excited. So my ICE investigator called, he goes, okay, we got our first case. I'm gonna bring him by your office. And I was like, yes, 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 so happy. And so I called up the battered women's shelter and I was like, hey, we might need you to, just for 2 nights and then we can move them into the Methodist women's home. And I called up the Rape Crisis Center who had bilingual therapists. And I was like, hey, we have our first case and maybe they're going to need therapy, so just put on your radar. And then they pull up and these 2 men get out of the back seat. I'm like, what is this? We had planned everything around having women. And so that was a big like, whoa. So we got housing and things eventually worked out as far as their immediate housing and those things. But then they were struggling. They were having some real issues. They weren't working. They didn't have work authorization. They were getting really stressed. They hadn't been paid. They'd been working for months and weren't paid. That was the whole trafficking thing. And so their families back home in their home country were just getting really angry and putting a lot of pressure on them. Like, you've got to send money home. So they were very stressed. They started drinking a lot. So I'm like, are these guys like, would you talk to someone, maybe help you feel better? And they can give you some tips on what to do. And they seemed kind of open to therapy. And so I drive them to the only bilingual clinician I had on my radar at the Rape Crisis Center. And the guy's like, oh, miss, things were not good for sure, but it wasn't that. Like, they did a lot of bad things, but not that thing. And I'm like, oh, no, we know. It's just, but this is the thing. And they would not get out of my car. They were like, oh, we don't, no, miss, we're not, we don't need that. And they just were like sinking in the back seat of the car because, their English wasn't great, but they knew Rape Crisis Center and they knew that wasn't what had happened and they would not get out of that car. So the clinician ended up coming to our office and it worked out, but just, you need choices. Like, you don't just check off the box of like, and I have housing and I have a therapist and you need some array there. And then certainly that working relationship with the other stakeholders like law enforcement, legal service provider, court personnel, that's also really critical. It's really critical to maintain those good relationships so that if something does go wrong, you can call them and work things through and advocate on behalf of your client. I certainly worked a lot very closely with the law enforcement folks that were investigating the cases we were working on. And sometimes there wasn't enough evidence and the case didn't move all the way through prosecution. Other times it did, but it was helpful for them sometimes to sort of check in with the clients and like, yeah, we're working. We've found this, we found that person, we've arrested this person, we're getting this kind of evidence, just to kind of keep them informed. And I could reach out and say, they're starting to get really antsy. They're talking about going back, to the home country. Is there any progress? Is there any reason for them to stay? And just having that relationship. And then certainly for safety reasons, it was critical. We did have a few incidents where it was really important to have law enforcement come out, help with some safety, this is old school, but like, putting in good protections on the internet and really helping, and then talking through with the clients in this particular shelter about how to keep themselves safe, what were the risks of a lot of this online back page kind of things they were getting involved in. So anyway, it's important to have those relationships with the legal service provider. Sometimes a client can just sort of finally they feel comfortable and they just drop a big bomb of like, well, then this and this and this happened. You're like, whoa, 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 whoa. We need to call your attorney and get that added into the application and things. So it's important to keep those lines of communication open. Almost done. And then these cultural, historical, and gender issues, I think certainly in the last couple of years in particular, I think we've all been, our eyes have really been open to just, how difficult it is for people who've either individually had a history with institutions and systems that were really negative, to overcome those and have a more trusting relationship or have the buy-in to work with these institutions and systems. And then also recognizing that an individual didn't have to have a negative experience if they identify with a community that has had very public, very, everyone saw on the news, these kind of really negative interactions. And it's just recognizing that if someone had really bad experiences, that's going to cloud their judgment, cloud their comfort level, their willingness to work, with law enforcement or with a legal service provider or with children's services, CPS or any other number of institutions with a faith-based Catholic organization. And then similarly, again, it doesn't even have to be that they had that experience, but if they can identify with a community, identify with a person, with an individual who had a highly publicized negative experience, that can carry over. And so you just have to be really aware of that, really upfront about that, and also work to have then more one-on-one relationships and contacts. And it can really help if someone is like, I don't like the police. And you're like, can you meet my officer that I work with? I know this guy, we've worked together for this many years, just meet this guy. And those then one-on-one relationships can overcome some of these more generalized systemic feelings people can have. It's not always possible. It's not always that simple. It can ebb and flow. There can be things that happen in other places that gets a lot of media attention that can, people are like, oh, like, now I don't want to, move forward, or now I am afraid of this person, or now I don't want anything to do with this anymore. So that kind of people's relationships and feelings with institutions and with systems can vary. It can be dynamic. The other thing that is important to sort of recognize is that there can be these cultural or just, community-wide norms where people are also distrustful of particular kinds of services. I'm not going to go to therapy. No one in therapy. There can be biases against certain kinds of alternative kind of medical treatments. If you're like, just try meditation, or like people are like, oh no, that's where we come from, that's considered magic, and that's a bad thing. And so just being really mindful of people's perceptions. Again, that fear of institutions, that fear of systems when it comes to medical care can be huge. We did a lot of work on a totally different project of mine where we were looking at female genital cutting and mutilation. And what we found is that our medical system, our OBGYN system, is very medicalized, which is really off-putting to a lot of women coming in from other countries where there are more midwives. And so you might go to the hospital if you get hit by a car and you're very broken up and need, surgery and lots of your bones set. Like, yes, put me in an ambulance, take me to a hospital. But if I'm having a baby, don't take me to a hospital. I want a midwife. I want a doula. And so just recognizing that we're a very medicalized country, and we do a lot of our medical and mental health care in a very medicalized system. And there's a lot of people around the world who are now here that are not comfortable with that kind of system. And so just being very mindful of that as well. And then the collective trauma, I think, I work at the Bishops' Conference and Catholic. I pay attention to like, what is the Pope doing? And to see him go out to Canada in this last week, meeting with the Indigenous First Nations communities there in Canada, who over the last few years have been discovering just how damaging the schools were for their children in these Indigenous schools that they were sending the children away to boarding schools by and large in order to assimilate them into the mainstream Canadian culture, and just recognizing that as if that wasn't pretty bad and harmful and a lot of maltreatment, that a lot of them were dying and just sort of in these unmarked graves and the disrespect there. So in thinking about, this intergenerational trauma is very real. And so again, if you're from a community where historically you have felt like, I can't trust these institutions, or if your parents went through a very traumatic childhood, then their parenting skills perhaps are also a bit off. And so there's again, these, it doesn't have to have happened directly to a person for them to be impacted by something that happened to people they identify with, whether it's their parents, grandparents, or their whole community. And so just recognizing that when you're serving people, and again, letting them take the lead, letting them tell you how they identify and who they identify. If there's incidents on the news, and they come in and I saw this on the news and now I feel bad because I'm identifying with that person. And it's important to let people self-identify in a lot of ways, I think. And I think we're all becoming a lot more aware and sensitive to that. And again, this is something that's probably a lot easier maybe for the social service folks to adapt and to add into your programming, maybe a little bit less flexible for some of the other legal or the law enforcement folks to adapt, how you would interact. But it is, I think, possible just in your one-on-one interactions. And again, I think that goes a long way to have these personal relationships, that if someone is afraid of the police, or I don't even believe that my case is ever going to move forward. Like, let me introduce you to the prosecutor and he can describe just how passionate and committed he is to your case. You can make those kind of personal connections as a way of, I think, helping break down some of the big systemic fears and concerns. Okay, so I just was going to show a couple of examples. I've talked about some of them, so I won't go into much detail. Oh, peer support, last one. So this also is another area where we are really improving, folks, in how we work with and incorporate survivors and people with lived experiences into the work of anti-trafficking work. In particular, again, they've been doing it pretty well, honestly, in the refugee world, refugee resettlement world, again, hiring people from those communities. Honest, when I worked in the field, I was housed in a refugee resettlement office, and the first people would come from a particular refugee flow. And so people would, when I first started, and don't date me on this, but it was the people were coming from, like, the Burmese were beginning to come in from like Myanmar and Thailand. And the first people that arrived, there were two families and none of them spoke English. And we're like, oh, this is going to be really hard. But then about 2 weeks later, the next group came and one of the young men spoke English. And we're like, do you want to be a case manager? Because you can be a case manager because you're a case manager, right? Yes. And so we hired this guy, right, literally kind of off the airplane. And then he was a case manager for the other people. It's not the healthiest with boundaries, but it is, and we're learning to do that more with individuals with that lived experience in the trafficking world. Survivors can become case managers. They don't have to just get up and give testimony of, like, this is real, folks. This really happens to real people. It happened to me. They can be real employees, assets in that way. It's really helpful to incorporate people into the actual workforce itself. And then they're informing programs, they're informing the kind of work that's being done, and they're relating in better ways to the clients. It is really important, though, when you have people in those roles, that you are allowing them to be fully supported. I mean, first of all, they need to be compensated. So if you're having an advisory group of survivors, like, they should be paid. And finally, the presidential advisory, the National Survivor Advisory Council is now being compensated after many years of not being compensated, which was problematic. But anyway, if you are using or pulling together an advisory group, you want to make sure you're compensating people for their time. But then certainly if you hire them on as staff, it's really important for them to feel that they can not always, you don't want them to be like the token survivor that works here who has to keep always going out and introducing themselves as like, hi, I work here, blah, 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 I'm a survivor. They shouldn't have to keep announcing that. That should be something very much that they control, who knows, who doesn't know. They need to be very mindful of their boundaries. And if you're a manager, you need to be probably paying attention to all of your workforce, that they're paying attention to their boundaries, secondary trauma, that they're getting that kind of support, whether it's outside therapy, whether you're bringing someone in to work on that kind of secondary trauma off and on. But it's even more critical for people from that lived experience who really need to have boundaries, who really need to have those boundaries supported and help define and respect, and then have access for that secondary trauma. And then again, their privacy and confidentiality needs to be really respected. Who knows who they divulge that to is totally up to them. And so you don't sort of announce like, oh, we're doing our fundraising gala. Guess who's the second speaker? You are. You can't do that. You really need to be a lot more mindful of how they dictate that. Okay, so we did a program, and this will take 3 minutes, where we were providing these job readiness services to survivors of trafficking. The goals were to serve folks and get them ready for work or get them into a higher level of work. We also wanted to build capacity of the case managers that were working on the project. And then we wanted to develop tools for survivors, whether they're in our program or not going forward. Those were our 3 goals. This is what we were really focused on for the people enrolled in the program, the clients, was really to get them ready to either start working in legitimate work or if they already were working, to check on them, make sure they were doing okay, and then people who'd been in work to upgrade their jobs. This is not super critical, but this is just to say that we were really trying to have everything be as collaborative as possible, client-driven as possible, letting people make a lot of choices. And I don't know, this is probably not the best slide. So here, these are some of the assessments. These couple slides were trainings for the case managers. And that's kind of why I brought it, just to show that we were trying to like help them, be objective in how you're gathering some of these assessments, make it really strengths-based, how to use these 2 skill inventories that we had. And then also just being really mindful of how they were thinking through, like, this client has a lot of experience. We had several clients who had been domestic workers in kind of diplomat family type things, or just a live-in domestic worker, very exploitative situation for many years. And so then the idea that like, they probably are not going to want to work in a hotel as a housekeeper, which is a very common job for arriving refugees. They're probably not going to want to work in a daycare center, which is something that we often direct refugee women to, and these kind of, daycare collaboratives and things. And we're like, they're just not going to want to do the kind of work that they were forced to do in this really coercive, exploitative environment, even though they're very skilled at it and have a lot of experience. So just helping people reframe, like, well, if you can take care of a lot of little kids, you can multitask like no one's business, and you are probably very good at, de-escalating and working in a high kind of pressure situation with people. You're a real skilled people person. So just helping them recognize those translatable soft skills and hard skills. Something to think through. We wanted them to think about that in creative ways, not just sort of pipeline people into the kind of work they had been doing where they were being exploited. The individual employment plan, again, we really emphasized short, medium, long-term goals with relationships between those. They were building on it, had to be in consultation, had to be a living document. Okay. We really were trying to highlight these these areas of competency for the case managers. And these last two slides are maybe a little more simple, or maybe the easiest examples. So we really wanted to focus on, practicing with them responses. Like, you have to be really ready at a moment sort of to reinforce over and over again. Everything you say is voluntary, anonymous, confidential. Nothing you say here will be disclosed without your permission unless someone's in immediate danger. That we found that you had to give the language to the case managers so that they knew what to say if a client asked them something, or if a client began talking about something or asked how things were going to be used. That if you tell someone like, you just have to be really clear and careful and make sure that you do X, Y, and Z. If you don't give them actual language to use or examples to use, it's not very helpful. And so we had a lot of scenarios that we would do with the case managers to build their capacity to kind of change that mindset of, trust me, I know what I'm doing. Trust me, I have your best interest at heart. I'm a good case manager. I'm a good person. Trust me. I mean, you have to kind of get people to get out of that routine. And this takes longer. All of this takes longer than just like, okay, I have 15, we're gonna do a screening today. It should take about 20 minutes. And then it could take 20 minutes for the screening, but it better take 20 minutes before that to explain your role. Who else is engaged in their case and how are they going to be interacting with them? What is going to happen with the information you're about to collect that's very personal? Can they not answer some questions? Did you tell them they didn't have to answer all the questions? You need to take that time. We were very emphatic about taking that time. And then finally, in just thinking about some of the mental health needs when it came to the employment program, and this is where we were using people who primarily worked with refugee employment, the job developers from our refugee resettlement agencies, and just trying to help them recognize that, yes, people want to get to work, people want to be in work, they want to be earning, but for the trafficking folks, the workplace was the place of their exploitation and abuse. And so there are just some extra considerations that you might not have with a refugee client getting into a new job. And so just trying to make sure that that they were mindful of that. And again, helping to frame, like, you don't have to ask them all these probing questions in order to sort of be mindful of the kind of work you're pursuing with them, or that you don't have to, I don't know, like, once they're in work, your job isn't done. Like, I'm a job developer and placed you. Like, these folks need that ongoing engagement, ongoing feedback, and ongoing kind of check-ins as well. So these are the examples. I will say, and this is kind of my last, I don't have a closing slide because I guess it fell off the PowerPoint, but the closing slide really is, this kind of case management does take longer. It requires more thought. It requires more engagement with the client. It involves more that transparency that I think we're often not used to. And I think a lot of times we get really caught up in problem solving, fast problem solving. Like, you got an eviction notice? All right, hang on. Like, let me make this call. Here's a gift card for your groceries. Is everything else, you need a bus pass? Got it. All right, I'm on this now. I'm calling about the landlord, and we'll get this file, this form filled out. We'll get this emergency, payment for your landlord or whatever. All right, are we good? And you just have to like slow down at times, and especially in the beginning when you're working with someone at the very beginning, to take the time and be not only more engaging, but more transparent, and bringing them up to the level of like, you tell me what you need. You tell me what the problem sort of solution, or not what the solution to the problem would be. And not just sort of immediately jumping in and kind of saving the day, which is good, but then that's a one-day solution. And so we need to be thinking more broadly. So that's my presentation. Normally, I would also have a closing slide with my contact info, but I am actually moving to a new position. And so I will, when I figure out what my new contact info is, I don't have that I will have that in about 3 or 4 weeks. I will send that back to the Academy folks so they can distribute that so that you can reach out to me if you have questions after this. I just literally don't know my new email or anything will be, so. So thank you. Any questions, discussion? We have about 10 minutes.
We have a few questions from the online
Oh, okay.
participants. We have an advocate from Africa that is saying that many people still don't believe human trafficking is happening, and what can we do to fix that?
So that's a really tough question, because I do think that while there is really a value in the personal testimonies, there is a value in having people say, like, this is real. And I know that we had a conference several years ago, actually hosted by Caritas Internationalis, and the focus was on trafficking that happened within countries within Africa, between countries in Africa, and then people leaving different African countries up to Europe in particular. And there was a lot of discussion there about how do we counter the narrative of the traffickers and the labor brokers and the families who, want people to go and earn money and, get out of this country and go earn money in, the country next door or up in Europe. And it's really hard to counter those narratives of opportunity, those narratives of there are good paying jobs in, anywhere but here. It's really hard without having people come back and say, whoa, it is not good in London, or I couldn't even get to London. I got stuck in Libya and that was a nightmare. I mean, so I do think there's a value of having people with that lived experience giving testimony. There's a lot of good, though, fact-based reports and law enforcement studies, the UNODC, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. There's a lot of evidence that this is happening, and that it's probably happening from country that they're calling, that they're participating and living in. And so there is evidence that can be shared, that can be repackaged into public service announcements that talk about you can generalize, like you don't have to have like an actual witness recounting their nightmare to say, people that are crossing through the Libyan desert get kidnapped, and they can have PSAs. I know that Caritas Ethiopia has some actually great PSAs about not leaving and not falling for these big recruitment kind of schemes. So I would say lived experience testimony is helpful. Also, evidence to share, and in a public service announcement format.
Thank you. And we have another one from the West Coast that says, are clients telling you what you want to hear because they are afraid they are going to be institutionalized, incarcerated, or having their children taken away? If someone is fearing the mandatory report or a deportation, why would they not tell the service provider what the victim needs to hear to avoid further trauma or abuse?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's really, how it's all about trust. Like that question to me sounds like, if you're a provider, how can you trust what your client is telling you? You can certainly empathize, like, how can your client trust what I'm telling them? And I think part of that, again, is this notion that you sort of have to take the time to really just be transparent. Here's my role. Here's what I can control. Here's what I can't control, but I can influence. Here's what I can try and advocate for you, because at least I have connections. I don't know how much I can influence, but I can do the advocacy. I can't do this, but I know who can, and I'll refer you. I think it's just being super transparent about what you can do and kind of how much you can do. And then it's having those relationships. If someone's really worried about deportation, you need to call an immigration attorney to speak with them. If they're worried about their child in child protective custody, you need a family lawyer to talk to them about what are the options, what are the consequences of this or that happening. And so I think it's just being really transparent, really honest, and then finding the people with expertise if you don't have the right expertise.
And we have another question internationally, and it says, what can you advise me as a victim of human trafficking?
I mean, that's a tough question. Also, we came up with our program to try to get people into dignified work and to move towards self-sufficiency. Part of the reason we did that was because in our own satisfaction surveys of our case management programs, people were like, I wish we spent more time on employment. But also the survivors here in the US, there is a National Survivor Advisory Council here in the US. And every year that they pulled them together and they made recommendations and did a report, every year they said, we want job readiness. We want employment assistance. We want to get into jobs. And I would say as a survivor, finding a meaningful path forward for yourself, whether it's working or working in some other capacity, if you're not ready for work, you know, to find something to help you move forward with a longer kind of vision. And I think finding employment services, finding volunteer opportunities, finding a mentor that can help vision, what can I be doing in 1 year, in 5 years, and what are the steps to get there, and have someone help map out these steps, because you can't bite off the whole elephant, but you can, I don't know, bite its, that's the wrong one. But this idea that you can get overwhelmed if you're trying to think of a giant goal. You need someone to help you break it down into manageable small steps.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. We will be having 4 past and present members of this council attending tomorrow for our last session.
Oh,
so you will
fantastic.
hear from them in the working group. And we have time for one more question before we break for the luncheon.
So we've been hearing yesterday and today a lot about trauma, the trauma-informed approach. How important is it, do you think, for the general public to understand that law enforcement and service providers are using that approach and why they're using it?
I mean, I think that, I don't know. First, I don't think we're all using it. I think if organizations, if law enforcement, like specific agencies are using it, I do think it's helpful to promote success. And so the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the National Institute of Justice, which is their research arm, Bureau of Justice Assistance is kind of their technical assistance arm. They've been doing a great job over the last few years of evaluating these task forces, the task force model, the multidisciplinary model, funded service programs. And I do think it helps to show, you know, we're learning, we're progressing as a field. People who have had these horrible experiences can turn corners and move on with their lives. And I think that is really important, mainly so that other organizations will adopt it. But if you're talking about just the general public, I do think that all of us get that, it's like, I can't think what it's called, but like, it's like the fatigue of like, I can't help one more, you know, cause, because it seems too big. And I think at times human trafficking can be one of those where it feels like, oh, it just keeps getting worse. There's just more and more cases, more and more people are getting caught up in it. There's more and more weird forms of it that are, you know, impacting more kids. And I think it can feel overwhelming. And when people feel overwhelmed, they don't move forward. And that's the case of a survivor. And that's the case of like a good Samaritan who just feels like, why would I even volunteer? Why would I even donate money? Why would I even call my congressman if it's not going to get better? And so I think there is a value in hearing these successes and this progress that we're making, if only to sort of like shake everybody up. Like, no, we're moving, you know, don't get burned out, don't tune out, keep going. So maybe that would be the value.
Thank you. Let's give Dr. Chester a hand.